Hello, I'm Janet Silver, and this is Top of Mind. With the rise of populism and an increase in polarization magnified by the pandemic, trust in democratically elected governments and democracy itself is eroding. In this series, we will talk about those threats, what makes for good governance, including the role of a professional, nonpartisan public service, and offer possible solutions to restore public trust in our institutions. Susan Delacourt is a national columnist for the Toronto Star based here in Ottawa. She's been covering Parliament Hill for over 30 years, and during that time has written 4 books about politics in Canada. Joel-Denis Bellavance is the Ottawa bureau chief for La Presse. He's been covering Ottawa politics for over 20 years. Both Joel-Denis and Susan are sought-after commentators to help explain the political landscape in Canada to audiences and viewers around the country. Joel-Denis, Susan Delacourt, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation.
I'm going to start with the Top of Mind study, which is why we're here today, which is the result of a partnership between the Institute of Governance and the Brian Mulroney Institute of Government. The study was conducted in 2021, and it focused on senior executive leaders working in all 3 levels of government. Susan, after going through this survey, what stood out for you?
I think, I was left a little disturbed when I read it. The ways in which politics and some of the negative things in politics are bleeding into public service. And I think, it's been a disturbing couple of years here too. And I don't think we could have expected that the public service would remain immune or intact or insulated from any of that. But I think I was really struck by some of the ways in which people still believe in institutions, but we're at the ways in which people felt at a bit of a loss to explain how to maintain trust in institutions in a time when it seems so easy for that to fall apart.
Joel-Denis, what about you?
Well, to me, what stood out and which I find really interesting and fascinating was the fact that higher public servants fear that Canadians in the long run may lose faith in their own institutions. And that is quite telling because public servants see the machinery of government within. They know what's going on inside, out of the government. And they, during this pandemic, they work a lot to provide services in a very fast way to secure the economic and health futures of Canadians, but they felt that the trust that Canadians may have towards the institution may be less what it should be, and so that to me was very telling. And so that means to me that they know that there is a consequence just with the kind of political discourse we see in this country. It has an impact, and they see it within. So that's very revealing to me.
I mentioned off the top, you both have been covering politics here in Ottawa for a number of years. I'm wondering, looking back from when you first came to Ottawa as a journalist to where we are now, a couple of decades later, what has changed in terms of how you cover government and relations, if you will, with public servants?
Can I answer that with a story? Journalist's favorite. I love telling the story because no one believes it. It's when I first got to Ottawa, I was very interested in how the government was handing out money for employment programs. And this was in the days where you got access requests back, with those big sheafs and sheafs of documents. So I went through these things really carefully. And the Deputy Minister of Employment at the time was a man named Arthur Kruger, now dead, but school named after him at Carleton, a really, really nice man. And Arthur Kruger himself phoned me up. This junior reporter at the Globe and Mail phoned me up and he said, "You seem to be really interested in how the employment system works. Why don't you come in for a couple of days and just shadow me?" And I just walked around with Arthur Kruger for 2 days at employment and learned, went to meetings. The idea that that would happen today, on either side, first of all, that your employers would give you 2 days to just roam around inside a department, that a deputy minister would trust a member of the media to come in and spend 2 days there. But I've never forgotten it. And it was, I think I would love for that to happen more often. I don't know that, I can't speak for JD, but I think the most we see now of deputy ministers is at committee meetings and where everything, it does seem there are more walls now between the media and the public service. There way more than there were when I first got to Ottawa.
I totally agree, Janet, with Susan's assessment. And the word walls that you used came to my mind when you asked that question. So Susan and I have the same experience. And there seems to be a higher level of suspicion toward the media. And I can explain why. Maybe it's the nature of the beast that has changed so much with social media and the advent of the internet. When I started, the internet did not exist or barely existed. So it gives me, some kind of an age in this system. But with the fact that you have to write news as it happens, makes it less time for us to build that kind of relationship that Susan just mentioned. But to me, I'm trying to work through that by doing that, trying to build human relationship with people, especially ministers. Deputy ministers, they seem to be a little bit more reserved than in the past. I don't know if that's the nature of the governments we've had in the past. I think the succession of minority governments built some kind of sort of walls between the media and the machinery government because, the political masters changed so much or were in constant election mode that, didn't allow the kind of relationship that Susan alluded to build or to emerge. But that's why, I'm trying to establish a relationship with human beings, because at the bottom of the fundamentally, we are human beings, and trust starts with building relationship with human beings. And that's why I go about my business today, because it has changed over the last 20 years.
But you both talk about that wall and not having the kind of access to deputy ministers, for example. How does that impact your job in trying to get to the facts and tell your story and disseminate information for viewers at home?
I find there's now, there's a real emphasis on communication is sort of the chief skill that everybody is supposed to have. And ideally, communication is only one thing that you're supposed to do. But there's a real guarded sense, sort of a zero tolerance of error culture. And we in the media have fed that too,
Yeah.
I wonder, and I have been wondering a lot lately, whether not just we in the media, but the politicians and the political discourse for at least the last, some politicians would tell you forever, but this Ottawa is broken and we're going to fix it thing that happens in every election. I wonder if that's worn down the institution. Jack Layton did it. He had a famous ad of Ottawa is broken. That's back 20 years ago. The idea that to be inside Ottawa is somehow corrupt, which I think is a word thrown way too much around as well. The whole idea that to be inside the system, there is something fundamentally wrong with that. I don't think that's helped anybody. And we know this. The stories that get on front page are stories of when government screws up or government wastes your money. And I try not to use, for example, the idea of citizens as taxpayers as synonyms. I don't think the government is just in the business of delivering services and taxes, and it's transactional. So I just packed a lot into that answer, but I think this whole idea that there's something fundamentally corrupt about the system, which all politicians have fed into, every single one of them, every single party, is probably responsible for some of this breakdown in trust.
One element I'd like to mention, Janet, is the fact that because of the pandemic, we've seen less, if I may say, media sessions by deputy ministers to inform us when the big legislations or big reforms are introduced in the House of Commons. And I hope this pattern ends with the end of this pandemic, because we need that kind of access to high senior officials to explain to us the nature of some of the reforms that are being introduced by the government. So sometimes it is not even explained to us in a regular fashion. It's more on the fly, and they gave us the documents after the press conference is over. So we don't have time also to properly inform ourselves during a media session information so that we can inform our readers properly afterwards. So that's, to me, is a dangerous path that I hope will end, because that's a pattern we've seen during the pandemic, and it's not helpful for our job, and also to maintain that kind of proper discourse and proper dissemination of information. It's necessary. In the past, I would go back to the Chrétien days when he was in government. We used to have, government officials that would be available for like 2 hours to explain to us, for example, unemployment insurance reforms. That was necessary. Then you'd have the press conference. You could have, the proper questions to the government of and ministers. But we don't see that anymore. In fact, sometimes the press release or the press media information was given after the whole thing was over. So we don't have time to prepare for that.
Just to pick up and go back to a little bit more what we were talking about a moment ago in terms of public trust in the institutions. And we started off the top, Susan, you were saying that one thing that stood out for you was these senior executive leaders saying that they had lost or were losing trust in public institutions. And you both have talked about how that has happened over the years. I'm wondering, was there a particular administration, an event where we really saw that trust start to decline, an election campaign, or is it a buildup over the years?
I think it's a buildup. I was lucky enough, this is going back quite a while now. I was invited to a dinner with some deputy ministers, and we tried to talk about when the line had started to emerge. And these were very smart people around that table. There was about a dozen of them. And they said it was during the Paul Martin era, that they saw a real bleeding between politics and the public service. That had started when Paul Martin took over for Chrétien. But it certainly worsened, if you can put it that way, during the Harper years. Stephen Harper had a very distinct idea of Ottawa being the problem. That they fundraised off saying that their own government was screwing up. I remember Health Minister Ron Ambrose sending out a fundraising letter saying, contribute money so that what happened at Health Canada never happens again. And I thought, this is the weirdest, this has got to be the strangest thing, a government campaigning against itself. But that was how Harper kept unity in the Conservative Party, was to position it always as that Ottawa is run by Liberals and longtime insiders, and we are outsiders in power. And I think that decade really sort of sealed the view. Also, I think, I'm not as familiar with public service as some are, but I think there's a lot more movement now. You don't see deputy ministers staying forever in a job, becoming like a senior statesman. So the chance to develop relationships like with an Arthur Kruger, for me, it doesn't exist, because they're shifting around all over the place too. And certainly the centralization of power. I don't think Justin Trudeau is reminded often enough about how he said he was going to decentralize power of the Prime Minister's office. And it is one of the more centralizing Prime Minister's offices I've ever seen. There's a bottleneck there. Like nothing happens in this government without the say-so of PMO.
I would add to that point, just to give you an example, Janet, that the position of the ambassador of Canada to France is empty, is vacant. It's been vacant for almost a year now. And the Prime Minister has the proposal by the Foreign Affairs Minister on his desk, but it's been sitting on his desk for 3-4 months because he has not given his approval. And so we've got many positions like that in the government machinery that are empty because the Prime Minister and his office did not proceed in a very efficient manner. I'd like to go back to when you said that the trend changed. I would say that maybe it started under Paul Martin, as some public officials, some senior officials have mentioned to Susan, but I would say that it accelerated or accentuated during the Harper years, when there was a sort of a rule imposed on senior government officials, ambassadors, scientists, not to speak publicly to the media. And that is, I think, undermined the kind of a flow of information that would, help us do our job. And that was, I would say, really bad for public policy and also the trust that Canadians may have in their institution. If they can't trust the people that run the machinery of government in Ottawa by speaking on things that are, important, but also that they know about, that I think undermine the overall trust of Canadians towards their institution.
Yeah, I have a little story about that again. That's always a story. Way back in 1989, I took this nobody named Gary Dewar to a press gallery dinner. He was just then the leader of the NDP in Manitoba. And because Meech Lake and the Constitution, Manitoba was very important in that, I got to know Gary Dewar very well. Then he became a premier. Throughout my entire career dealing with Gary Dewar, I could always get him on the phone. He would sometimes come out of his premier's office and go meet me in a hotel, or, we always, that sounds wrong, meet me in a hotel, so far. Yeah, Gary Dewar and I, and the only time that man ever refused to talk to me was when he was appointed ambassador to the United States by Harper. And I, for love or money, could not get an interview with him. It was just not possible. It was, and we're talking about a 25-year long association, and I could not get through to Gary Dewar. And again, even when he was a premier negotiating the health deal with Paul Martin here, remember that big meeting? He was coming out and meeting reporters and talking to them, but the law was when he became ambassador, no more friendly relations with the media.
And given that you then lose that relationship and that ability to get deputy ministers, ambassadors on the phone, then what do you do as a journalist when you're trying to confirm a story or make sure that what you're writing about is accurate and that you've got input from the other side, if you will?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, we have to work around that. I'll give you an example. Sometimes the federal budget, when it's tabled, you need to dig really hard to get some stuff confirmed. So what you do, you work around it. You talk to stakeholders. They are told ahead of time what's in the budget. So that's how I do work around and try to get some confirmation about some of the elements that may be in the budget. I've done that in the past and it worked well. But this year I didn't have to do it because there were a lot of leaks, I think, prepared by the PMO and the Prime Minister's office, so we didn't have to do that job this year.
Yeah, I'd echo what JD says. You work around, but JD, and it helps that he's charming. Forming those human relationships with people, right? That my example I would give is the night the Liberal NDP deal came out. I think JD is probably like me. The first we heard of it was when the two-party leaders, Singh and Trudeau, had to tell their caucuses. So the MPs started getting out there. But the only way I got it confirmed was because I had personal relationships with people who've been doing the negotiating. And those are cultivated over a long time. We had the rule that night at the Star anyway. We weren't going to go on the say-so of MPs who were texting us. We needed to hear from people who were actually present in the negotiations. And we got them, but we wouldn't have got them if we hadn't formed human relationships with people. And that's where the pandemic, that's an interesting, I thought the top of mind study was really interesting in that I had the same feeling. You could almost break the pandemic down into two parts. And the first part was government works, and this is a real chance to show that government can be back in people's lives again. And then it seemed like I almost blame Omicron or when with the resurgence of COVID, or when it hung in, and the exasperation and the feeling that government didn't work, and I liked the part in the study that says you really don't want to snap back to the pre-pandemic reality, because some of the stuff we learned, briefings from officials, we got them every day. We got the Prime Minister talking to us every day. We all became instant epidemiologists, that there was a lot of facts out there, and there was a lot good in that first part of the pandemic, but it seems the longer it went on, the more it did retreat back to the talking points. I've written about, if I hear "we have your backs" one more time, I'm going to pull out my hair. Like the sloganeering and talking points around the pandemic became wearying. Maybe they always would be, but I found there was a real sort of dividing line there.
The other thing that came out,
Susan, that's a very good point, if I may say quickly. There are two parts to this pandemic. I would say before probably the third or the fourth wave, when the government seemed to be in real control of getting vaccines to people, and getting protective equipment also. Programs that were started quickly were pretty efficient to save a lot of businesses and help Canadians pay their mortgage while they were not working. But afterwards, I think there was a breakdown when the third and the fourth and the fifth wave, we thought it was over. People were hoping that we would move on to something else, go back to normal life, but we're still in this pandemic.
Picking up on all of that, though, during all of this, and maybe it was during the second wave, if you will, of the pandemic, there was a lot of misinformation that we started seeing coming out, and a lot on social media. And that's going back to one of the things that participants in this study said, that they felt that misinformation, social media, was all impacting public trust and democracy. And I'm interested to see where the two of you come down on that. Do you share those beliefs as well?
Yes. I found the Freedom Convoy, I don't think this is going to be controversial, well, depending on the audience for this. I found that an incredibly disturbing development here. I found it wasn't just the occupation of Ottawa. It was what was fueling the occupation of Ottawa and some of the severe misconceptions about how Ottawa worked, going from the lunatic fringe, and I am going to call it the lunatic fringe, who were waving Nazi flags and saying that Justin Trudeau was the son of Fidel Castro, right up to people occupying Ottawa for an end to mandates that were provincial. That they're not every Canadian is supposed to memorize the division of powers in the Constitution, but the idea that a mass temper tantrum and occupation of a city could end a public health measure in a province was just crazy to me. And the idea that this was being fueled and radicalized really worried me. There were those of us who were accused of not knowing our history or whatever. I went on the road with the Prime Minister during the election campaign and saw those protests, which were like the trailer for the movie of the Ottawa occupation. And I really worried after that these people were ungovernable. Like these are citizens who don't actually believe in government, and that is very, very worrying to me. And it worries me that it's out there now. We saw it happening in the United States, but it's not just illiteracy. Somebody or some people are actually fueling this idea and capitalizing on a mistrust for political ends or whatever. But you realize how shaky that is when something like the convoy protest could happen. That was disturbing and should be.
Yeah, I agree with that too, that misinformation was clearly a big problem during the pandemic and during the convoy that Susan described. And I think the government is conscious of that social media in itself, without rules and proper governance, is a danger for democracy. And that's why I think they're trying to make sure that the media, the mainstream media, as we call it, which is a pillar of democracy in my sense, because I know I'm biased. I work for media, but I think we play a role that is very critical in democracy. I think the government is conscious of the nature of the threat, and that's why they're trying to make sure that the traditional media that plays a role, that has been playing a role for over 200 years, if not more, in a democracy, can thrive and survive in this very difficult period for many media. So, and that's one of the pillars that they have to maintain, but they also have to address mistrust towards other institutions in Canada, the Parliament, the courts, and the Bank of Canada, to name one that has been attacked by one one politician in particular, it is important. And that's, I think, it goes to say that people who run for office have a responsibility that the office for which they run is trusted and maintained. And otherwise, they're going to end up with a bad surprise that they will have helped create. And that's, a very important lesson that people have to remember.
I want to balance my very bleak thing about the comment with something positive. One of the big differences, and JD knows this too, in our jobs now is I actually know what people are reading. We can sift through the data of what people want to read and what they don't read. We never had that in my early days. So I can see moment to moment what people are reading online at the Toronto Star and what they like to read. You would think that it would be disheartening sometimes to read that. It's not. What people want to read are stories of politicians and people working together. Those stories are, I wrote a story early in the pandemic about Doug Ford and Krista Freeland, and it is still one of the most read stories in the Toronto Star ever. People like that story. The other thing that people really like to read are explainers, things that explain to them. What they don't want to read, politicians yelling at each other. Politicians, those stories just go right over readers' heads. They're not interested in them. Some, if it's extreme, they do. But mostly what people want to read is what's really going on. What does this mean to me? Are politicians really working together? And the horoscope. They really like that too.
I'll try to remain upbeat, so I won't ask about how popular obituaries are, okay?
The advice columnist asked the Toronto Star is always in the top 10. Always in the top 10.
Going back, Joel-Denis, to something you said just a moment ago with regards to trying to secure, if you will, the role of traditional media. But traditional media, as we all know, has come under increasingly attacks, right? People saying, it's disinformation, it can't be believed. How do you, as journalists, then try to ensure that traditional media that there's trust in traditional media for what you do, aside from what the politicians are doing? But how do you try to ensure that the information is not just accurate, but that that is the role of the traditional media?
That's a very good question. And I feel I have a responsibility to do that because of my job, that I feel maybe because I'm a bit an idealist, but I want to remain that way until my last breath. So one of the roles that I can play is to engage with readers. And that's what I do a lot. I get some emails from readers and I respond as much as I can to when they have questions, when they have criticism. If I'm wrong, I will admit it and say, I'm sorry, and I correct it. So that's how you maintain trust. And also, I think by having covered Parliament Hill for the last 25 years, I think I've carried with me some kind of reputation. So there's a level of trust. I think people are used to seeing my name in the paper and they used to read. And in fact, I get sometimes some emails from a former cabinet minister in Mulroney and a former who was appointed later as a judge. And he comments on my story and I exchange with him. And that's a fun way to do it. But I do that with all regular readers. And that gives me a sense of the kind of feedback that I have from readers. Give me a sense of what their priorities, their concerns, and grievances. And that helped me also adapt or adjust or maybe do an effort to do some kind of stories that will interest them even more.
Yeah, that's such a good answer. I think transparency. I really liked Twitter when it first came along because it gave me a chance to talk directly to readers. And it gave readers a chance to see our jobs in real time. Janet and JD, a lot of our work is spent sitting around talking to each other, waiting for stuff to happen. He's standing outside a cabinet meeting. He's standing outside question period. And that conversation that reporters have amongst themselves, we were sharing with our readers. And I think that kind of helped for a while. I really think, again, if you have to pinpoint a moment, Donald Trump's use of Twitter and the Trump era, that really changed social media forever. I keep saying, wait, I just didn't know you could lie on Twitter, and I didn't know that would work. That was a shocking thing. So like JD, I do try to engage with readers. I also, though, block people who make personal attacks. The whole discussion about the government's help for the media or the government's role in the media is really, really complicated. And it has not helped us, I will say, because there is a whole other side out there feeding this idea that people like JD and I are paid to report on the government, right? And we're not, but somebody has to pay us, and it used to be advertisers, and now we try to do it through readers. That's our business model. Actually, our business model is more democratic than the old media model, which depended on big companies and big interests financing us. Now it's dependent on reader to reader. So I think we be transparent, like JD says, admit when we made a mistake, admit when we've only got like part of the story, and say why we only have a part of the story, and stay away from getting involved in fights, either on Twitter or between political parties, because that's another big difference. Is I think the politicians enjoy making the media a target in all kinds of ways. And I'm not talking about just conservatives. Liberals do it too. They, I don't want to be in a world where media is seen as partisan or a partisan tool, even though we're called the Red Communist Toronto Star. But I think I don't think we live in that world, and I don't want us to live in that world either.
I'm going to turn now to federalism, because both of you have covered federal politics for a number of years, but you've also covered the ongoing discussions around unity and constitutional crisis, over the past couple of decades, and also the polarization within this country. And we've seen a lot of polarization in recent years, and some of the senior executives polled in this survey have indicated that around things like vaccine mandates. And we've seen polarization recently within political parties. And I'm wondering, I'd like to get a sense from both of you how you think this polarization, do you think we are a polarized nation, or is that just something that people are grabbing as an excuse, if you will? Is there polarization in this country? And how is that contributing to, if it is, to trust in our public institutions and democracy itself?
That's a great question, if I may start. In Quebec, we were part of we saw the debate of separation versus federalism. So we saw polarization for the last 40 years, if I may say so. But that debate is sort of moved out of the political picture. And that, for me, is a relief, because writing constantly about, whether Quebec would separate or Quebec would go on its own way, or federalism versus separation, that was, a never-ending story. And I'm glad that we're moved on to something else. But there are other polarization issues that came up on the political radar. You mentioned vaccination, but I would go to the environment. This is a very polarizing issue, because people's livelihood in the West depend on pipelines and energy and all that. Whereas in Quebec, we're lucky to have, hydroelectricity. So we don't have the same conception about the need to fight climate change. And that brings a new kind of polarization in Canada. The environment is a good example. And also, the role of the state in the economy. We've seen, a little bit more, during the pandemic, as Susan mentioned, the federal government was there and I think played the role that it had to play to help secure people's future and help them put food on the table and pay the bills. But now with higher deficits coming up, deficit and the debt that has increased as a result of it, the debate will switch again. What's the role of the government in the economy? How should we, try to go back to a balanced budgets and to better prepare the economy for the future? That's going to be a polarizing figure as well. And we've seen also polarization between urban centers and rural Canada. They have different needs. In rural communities, they don't have, collective transport en commun, collective transportation to be able to go to work. They need to have their car to be, and so there are very different things. And to survive through it all, I think dialogue will be the key to it. And who can ensure it? The political discourse, of our leaders will be very key to that. Otherwise, polarization may increase. That's my fear.
My joke has been, even to people in the Prime Minister's office, I really miss constitutional crises.
I don't.
I don't really, but they were normal. They're not like a global pandemic or a Donald Trump or a war in Eastern Europe. I wouldn't mind an old-fashioned constitutional crisis right now. I talk to premiers too, and talk to people who are listening. There's a real schism there. Publicly, it looks like there's a lot of opposition between the provinces and the federal government, but it's also true there have been more phone calls and conversations because of the pandemic between the premiers and the Prime Minister than there have ever been. And I'm told those conversations are very friendly and useful. And that Chrystia Freeland and Doug Ford, that kind of relationship happens all over the governments, that there is a good working relationship. I do see polarization though, and it's politicized. To all the ones that JD mentioned, I would add men and women. I think there is a real sense that government and institutions now helping women, that's to redress an historical imbalance, but that men are being left out of that. I think we have to pay attention to that conversation. I think there was an element of that to the convoy protest, for example, which, was overwhelmingly men, not all men, but overwhelmingly men. Urban, rural, that's another one. Just before the pandemic hit, there was the issue of the Indigenous blockades too. And I felt like we were hurtling toward some real polarization on Indigenous reconciliation too. These are issues that this government rightly, I think, and appropriately put in the front window. But I think the people who felt that they were on the other side of that, whether it was Indigenous reconciliation or the feminist agenda and all of those things, are feeling like they've been left out by government and are feeling they've been left behind. And I think that's a polarization we're going to have to address. We saw what happened in the United States when those constituencies weren't. And I think, I know this government's view is that the way to cure that populist angst and everything is just to show people that government works, like it did during the pandemic. I'm worried that's not enough. And this study made me worry that worry is shared by senior people in this government and senior people in public service, that what do you do to show people government works when there's so many forces that see an interest in chipping away at that?
And I guess I would add a question with that as well. What do you do when you have politicians and people who are running for high office in this country who are polarizing and who are taking a very populist message across the country? Does that add to the divide, or is that just part of politics?
I think we got to be really careful whether we feed that or explore it. And you saw the media have a huge crisis of the soul when Trump got in. Why didn't I was always less interested in Trump by the people who supported it. And I think JD has done yeoman's service on this. He went across the country before the pandemic and spent an entire summer. We've got to get out and talk to the people who are frustrating them and not just feed the political machine. I do worry, though, that, this has become a cliche now, but it's the idea that there is no shared human experience around the media, like that everybody doesn't gather and watch one thing. There's not one set of facts or one history. And I worry, that the fragmentation of the media has led this idea that facts are just opinions. And I think that's worrisome. I don't know what you do about that, except go out there and find out what is feeding the underlying forces of the polarization.
I think to some point, if I may say, I think we have a problem of polarization, but I think it's been less severe than it could have been had the government not fight inequalities at its core mandate when it first arrived. To me, that I think helped reduce polarization, because when you fight inequalities, you give some kind of economic certainty to people who otherwise would suffer. I think that's one of the key problems in the United States, is that inequalities have been increasing over the years, and Trump made it worse by giving tax cuts to the richest in U.S. society, where the poor are still, who voted for him, are still left out of the economic pie. And Susan mentioned that I did endeavor to go to Western Canada in my RV, and I did discover the common thing was economic uncertainty or insecurity, and that's a real thing in Alberta, because they see their way of living slipping through their fingers, whereas for them 10 years ago, 15 years ago, the economic future was the brightest in Canada. So that's economic, and you have people who left, didn't go to university, but did find job in the energy sector that paid over $100,000 $100,000 a year in salary. Can they find that kind of job now with no education but no future in the energy sector? That's the problem, and that's a crisis I think that needs to be addressed. And I've discussed this in the past with the former finance minister, Bill Morneau, and he was very concerned about the future impacts of that kind of changes happening in Western Canada.
Yeah.
So I guess finally, we're talking about public trust, polarization, and the way forward. And I'm going to ask both of you to put on a heavier hat, if you will. If you were able to give the Prime Minister or anyone in the Prime Minister's office some advice in terms of trying to help restore public trust, and as journalists, your dealings with public servants to help you do your job, what advice would that be?
Stop making everything a communications exercise. Just the emphasis on, and don't be afraid to show your real selves. I think JD and I probably have this experience. I have discussions with politicians on all sides of the fence, and I don't recognize who they are on TV or at their press conferences. They're reading from scripts. I don't know how you counsel somebody to be authentic, but there's a reason that that some politicians can break through that, and I think that's what people really need to see right now. People, stop being afraid of making mistakes. Be your real selves. That sounds so Hallmark, but it's just this tight, scripted political response to everything that I think is feeding the idea, the public suspicion that there's got to be something else going on there.
Three things on that one. Authenticity, I think, is always a plus in politics. Be authentic, as Susan mentioned. Don't be too scripted. Then one example that I should give is that we discovered throughout this pandemic that François Legault can be very funny, very authentic, but he was not, because he was not scripted when he gave his press conference. So people kept quite a good memory of Mr. Legault. Second thing, manage expectations. Don't bring them to don't make promises that you cannot deliver on. So that's because you bring frustrations when you make real promises that you can deliver on, and so managing expectations is a key one. And finally, I think at the time when we are questioning ourselves about the trust in our institutions, don't hesitate to reach out to opposition parties, yes, to bring them into the fold, to make sure that your policies will be adapted to the circumstances of every region. Because there's no one-size-fits-all solution for every problem. And that's the nature of our country. We're diverse. We have very different regions. So that would be, I think, at the time of when we're questioning the trust of our institutions, reaching out to opposition parties, I think would be a wise advice.
That's all the time we have today. Joel-Denis, Bellavance, Susan Delacourt, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a really insightful conversation. Thank you.
It's fun. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation.